I remember it like it was yesterday. After gym class, I headed to the locker room to change back into my regular clothes. It was always a bit creepy in there, but that day, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, and a strange silence filled the room. As I stood in front of the mirror, I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in the dim reflection, I saw her, a girl about our age, standing just behind me. Her eyes were hollow, and she had an eerie, sad expression on her face. She was dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform that looked out of place. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. My heart was pounding, and I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But when I looked back at the mirror, she was still there, closer this time. Her lips moved as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. Panic set in, and I grabbed my things and ran out of the locker room. I didn't tell anyone at first, afraid they'd think I was crazy, but later, I found out I wasn't the only one who had seen her. Other students had reported similar experiences, always in front of the mirror in the locker room. We started piecing together the stories and learned that years ago, a girl had tragically died in that very locker room. Since then, her spirit has been trapped there, trying to reach out to anyone who would listen. To this day, I avoid that locker room if I can. The memory of her haunting reflection is something I'll never forget. It was a late autumn evening when it all started. My friends and I had decided to stay after school to practice for the upcoming basketball game. The old gym was usually deserted at that time, adding an eerie vibe to our practice sessions. That evening, as we were shooting hoops, we heard a faint noise coming from the other end of the gym. At first, we brushed it off as the wind or an old building creaking, but then the noises grew louder and more distinct. It sounded like footsteps and soft whispers. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. We walked towards the source of the sounds, which seemed to be coming from the storage room at the far end of the gym. As we approached, the air grew colder, and an unsettling feeling crept over us. When we reached the storage room, the door was slightly ajar. We pushed it open, and that's when we saw a faint, ghostly figure of a man. He was dressed in what looked like an old gym uniform and was pacing back and forth. His face was expressionless, and he seemed completely unaware of our presence. One of my friends whispered, "Do you see that?" And we all nodded, too scared to move or speak loudly. Suddenly, the figure stopped pacing and turned towards us. We froze in terror, expecting the worst, but instead of approaching us, he simply vanished into thin air. We stood there, stunned and unable to process what we had just witnessed. Eventually, we gathered our wits and ran out of the gym as fast as we could. When we shared our experience with the school staff, they revealed that years ago, a beloved gym teacher had passed away unexpectedly, and ever since, strange occurrences had been reported in the gym. It started during my sophomore year. Room 303 had always been the subject of ghost stories, but I never took them seriously until I experienced it myself. One late afternoon, I stayed behind to finish an assignment. The classroom was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. As the shadows lengthened and the daylight faded, I heard a faint scratching sound, like chalk against the blackboard. I turned around, expecting to see a teacher or another student, but the room was empty. Yet, the chalk was moving on its own, uttering something in elegant, old-fashioned script. My heart raced as I approached, trying to make out the words. Just as I got close enough to read it, the chalk dropped, and the temperature in the room plummeted. A chill ran down my spine, and I could see my breath fogging in the cold air. I wanted to run, but curiosity held me in place. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake off what I had seen. Desks would shift, books would fly off shelves, and there were whispers, soft, mournful whispers that sent shivers down my spine. Determined to uncover the truth, I convinced a couple of friends to stay after school with me one evening. Armed with a camera, we set up in room 303, our nerves on edge. Hours ticked by, and just when we were about to call it a night, the air grew heavy and cold. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows around the room. Then we heard a low, sorrowful humming coming from the back of the room. We turned, our hearts pounding, and saw her, a ghostly figure of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing by the window. Her face was pale, eyes hollow and filled with sadness. She moved slowly, almost gliding, towards the blackboard. Frozen in place, we watched as she picked up a piece of chalk and began to write. This time, we could see the words clearly. "Help me." Her voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed in the silence. "Help me." Panic set in, but before we could react, she vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. We later discovered that decades ago, a beloved teacher had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in room 303. No one ever found her, and the case went cold. The school eventually sealed off room 303, but the memory of that ghostly figure and her desperate plea for help haunts us to this day. It's a chilling reminder that some spirits remain bound to this world, seeking the closure they never found in life. When I was in elementary school, the playground was my sanctuary, a place of joy and laughter. But there was one part of the playground that no one ventured near, the old, abandoned swing set at the far end. It stood like a forgotten relic, rusting and creaking ominously in the wind. The stories surrounding it were whispered in hushed tones, and no one dared to approach it. One overcast afternoon, my friends and I were playing tag. I sprinted away, losing myself in the game, until I realized I was heading straight for the old swing set. As I drew closer, an eerie silence fell over the playground, and I could hear faint, chilling laughter in the distance. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It was the unmistakable laughter of children, but there was no one around. My heart raced as I cautiously approached the swing set. There, in the fading light, I saw them. Two ghostly figures of children, swinging slowly back and forth. Their faces were pale and their eyes hollow, yet they seemed to be laughing and playing. The sight froze me in place, my feet rooted to the ground in fear. Suddenly, one of the figures turned its head towards me. The laughter stopped, replaced by a haunting whisper that seemed to echo all around me. "Help us," they murmured, their voices filled with sorrow and desperation. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with terror. As I stood there, the temperature around me seemed to drop, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The ghostly children continued to whisper, their pleas growing more urgent. The swing set began to creak loudly, the chains clinking in a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a hesitant step closer. The moment I did, the ghostly figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the misty air. The swings continued to move on their own, swaying gently as if pushed by unseen hands. I bolted back to my friends, breathless and shaken. I tried to tell them what I had seen, but they laughed it off, thinking I was trying to scare them. But I knew the truth. Determined to understand, I approached the school janitor, an old man who had worked at the school for decades. With a grave expression, he told me the story. Decades ago, two children had vanished without a trace while playing on that very swing set. Despite extensive searches, they were never found. Some believed they had been taken, while others whispered of dark, supernatural forces at work. The swing set was left untouched, a silent memorial to the lost children. From that day on, I avoided the old swing set, but the memory of the ghostly children and their desperate whispers haunted me. The playground, once a place of joy, had become a place of fear and sorrow. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear their faint laughter mingled with mournful whispers, echoing across the deserted playground. The thought that their spirits remain trapped, endlessly seeking help, is a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that lurk in the shadows. It was supposed to be a routine day at school. I was working on a group project with some classmates in the old science lab, a place that had been unused for years and was always a bit eerie. The lab was filled with dusty equipment, and the windows barely let in any light. As we worked, we heard an odd noise coming from the back of the room. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. We tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the old building settling, but the noise grew louder and more distinct. Curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to investigate. We split up, with one of my friends checking the storage closet while the rest of us looked around the room. I was inspecting some old equipment on a shelf when I felt a cold breeze and heard a faint whisper. I turned around, but no one was there. The noise from the back of the room continued, and it sounded like someone or something was moving around. My friend who had checked the storage closet came back looking pale. He said the closet door had slammed shut by itself while he was inside. We were all on edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled for our phones to use as flashlights. The only light came from the dim glow of our screens, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the dim light, we saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and indistinct, moving slowly. We could hear the sound of shuffling footsteps coming closer, and the air grew colder. My heart was racing as I tried to make out what the figure was. One of my friends shouted, "Who's there?" But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to glide towards us, leaving a trail of cold air in its wake. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with the chorus of unintelligible voices. Later, we learned from a teacher that the old science lab had a dark history. Years ago, it was the site of a tragic accident involving a student who had been working alone late at night. Some said the student's spirit was still trapped there, unable to move on. We never returned to the lab, and the story of that day became a chilling legend among the students. The old science lab remains locked and unused, a haunting reminder of the mysterious and unsettling events that happened within its walls. Later, I learned more about the tragic accident that occurred in the old science lab. The story was that many years ago, a student had been working alone on a chemistry experiment late at night. The student was known for being meticulous and dedicated to their work, but on that particular evening, something went terribly wrong. The experiment involved a highly volatile chemical compound. According to the accounts, the student was trying to mix chemicals to create a new formula. There was an unexpected reaction, something that the student had not anticipated. The mixture exploded, causing a fire that quickly engulfed the lab. The student was trapped inside, and despite the emergency response, they were unable to escape in time. The aftermath was devastating. The lab was heavily damaged, and the student's life was tragically cut short. The incident was hushed up, and the lab was closed off. Over the years, there were rumors that the student's spirit lingered in the lab, unable to find peace due to the traumatic end of their life. This history cast a dark shadow over the lab, and the stories we heard about the noises and the shadowy figure seemed to fit with the tragic events of the past. The ghostly presence we encountered might have been that of the student, still trapped in the place where their life ended in such a tragic and sudden manner. It was an ordinary day at school, and I had to visit the principal's office for a minor issue. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed the new substitute principal had taken over the office. I had heard unsettling rumors about him, but I didn't think much of it at the time. When I entered the office, the room was dimly lit, with shadows dancing across the walls. The substitute principal sat behind his desk, his face partially obscured by the low light. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes sharp and unnervingly intense. I took a seat, and he began questioning me about the issue I was there for. His demeanor was cold and scrutinizing. As I spoke, I couldn't help but notice a large, old photograph hanging on the wall behind him. It was a black and white portrait of a man in an old-fashioned suit, his expression stern and foreboding. The longer I stared at the photograph, the more it felt like the eyes of the man were following me. My unease grew as the substitute principal's questions became more probing and personal. I could hear an odd, soft whispering that seemed to come from nowhere, adding to my discomfort. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered and went out, plunging us into near darkness. The substitute principal's voice became a chilling whisper as he leaned closer. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his tone both unsettling and sinister. My heart raced. I wanted to get out of there, but I felt paralyzed by fear. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath forming in the dim light. The photograph on the wall seemed to take on a ghostly glow, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped, my pulse racing as I looked around in panic. The substitute principal remained seated, his gaze fixed on me with an unsettling calmness. "You should go now," he said in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't need to be told twice. I fled from the office, my heart pounding in my chest. Later, I discovered that the photograph was of the previous principal, who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. The substitute principal's eerie behavior and the ghostly whispers seemed to be connected to the unsolved mystery of the former principal's disappearance. Later, I learned more about the disturbing history behind the photograph of the previous principal. The story was far more chilling than I had imagined. Years ago, the former principal had been a respected figure at the school, known for his strict but fair approach. However, one day, he vanished without a trace. The school was thrown into chaos as a massive search was launched, but no evidence was found. The disappearance remained a mystery, and rumors began to circulate. Some said the principal had been involved in a secret investigation or that he had crossed someone powerful. Others whispered about an underground network operating within the school's old buildings. The most unsettling theory, however, was that the principal had discovered something sinister about the school's administration or history and had been silenced before he could expose it. As the years passed, the principal's disappearance was shrouded in secrecy, with few details ever coming to light. The school eventually moved on, but the principal's office, where the photograph hung, was avoided by most students and staff due to its unsettling atmosphere. It wasn't until I encountered the substitute principal that the chilling details began to surface. The ghostly presence in the office seemed to be connected to the former principal's tragic end. Many believed the principal's spirit was still trapped there, unable to move on because of the unresolved mysteries surrounding his disappearance. The eerie encounter I had, combined with the stories of the principal's disappearance, suggested that the substitute principal might have been more than just an ordinary person. Perhaps he was connected to the unresolved past, or maybe he was a manifestation of the principal's restless spirit seeking answers. I always loved the library. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of school life and lose myself in a good book. But everything changed one late afternoon during my junior year. I stayed late to finish a research paper. The library was nearly empty, just the way I liked it. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows, and the only sound was the faint rustle of pages turning. As I was engrossed in my book, I heard a soft whisper. I looked up, but there was no one around. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from the rows of shelves behind me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I walked down the narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. My heart began to race as I turned a corner and saw a book fall off the shelf on its own. I froze, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was just gravity or a loose shelf. But as I picked up the book, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I quickly placed the book back and hurried to my table, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. Books would fly off the shelves, and sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of a shadowy figure moving through the stacks. My friends thought I was imagining things, but I knew what I had seen and heard. Determined to find out what was going on, I stayed late again, this time with the camera. I set it up facing the section where the strange occurrences had been happening and waited. Hours passed, and just when I thought nothing would happen, the whispers started again, louder and more frantic. I watched in horror as several books flew off the shelves simultaneously, and then I saw a ghostly figure, barely visible, moving between the rows of books. It seemed to be searching for something or someone. The figure stopped and turned towards me, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I felt a wave of sadness and longing wash over me before it vanished into thin air. Shaken, I reviewed the footage and saw everything I had witnessed. I took it to the librarian, who listened quietly before telling me about the library's tragic past. Years ago, a student had disappeared in the library, never to be seen again. Many believed their spirit was still trapped, searching for a way out or for someone to help them. The library remains a place of mystery and unease for me now. I still visit, but I'm always on edge, waiting for the whispers to start again. The ghostly figure's desperate search haunts me,